Right. So, hey, folks, it is December the 3rd, and we're talking about chapters 88 and 89. So, we're going to have a lecture notes today, but tomorrow I'm going to post you an assignment. So, there's going to be no lecture tomorrow. So, make sure you check on Google Classroom. And the terms we have on the board are city layout, that's for medieval cities, sanitation, merchant guilds, craft guilds, guild function, and benefits. So we're going to have some notes on those. But first, I'm going to go over, for those who are in the room, my class images. All right, kids. So, as you see here, medieval towns had their marketplaces, and the center of a town was always, whether it was a small like fiefdom where you had like your serfs and your peasants, or if it was a city, it was always the church within the center. And the church was always built next to a well or a water source. And surrounding the church on one side was a cemetery. Now, some places like France, they often didn't bury the dead. They'd often, buildings kind of like this, you had multi-story barns, and they would stack people in there. Not very sanitary.
Not efficient?
Not until problems happen. We'll talk about that later in the Renaissance. And of course, the marketplace, you see here, roads were rarely paved in many cities. You had these little stalls that looked like horse stalls, but that's actually where people would sell goods. Of course, there could be often like shrines, could be public places for executions and things like that. Cities often had buildings really stacked very close to one another. Fire was a constant and real danger with little protection or organization to prevent them from spreading throughout the whole city. Animal refuse was left lying around. Often trash pickup, your book is correct to say, was often from wild dogs and pigs running around eating what they could. And we're talking like there was no sewers. So often people just kind of went in the streets. And so there's countries that are kind of like that today. Like listen to accounts of people who were in the war in Iraq. A lot of the people who lived in cities, they didn't have toilets or functioning sewers. So they would have a hole in the wall, or essentially they'd stick like their rear end out the hole and just go on the street. So that's a real problem, right? So a lot of sanitary problems. So medieval life was the same. And as you see, one constant danger, and this is actually going to be a danger for a long time, even all the way up to like major cities in the United States, like New York, before they get good sewage, is people emptying their chamber pots or their leftovers from their kitchen out on the street. And you really didn't want to be like in the way when they were just tossing that nasty stuff out. So here you have some people
Running for dear life.
Yeah, running to keep nasty stuff off of them. City streets were narrow, dark, smelly, very disorganized, little in the way of law enforcement. Lots of the poor would come to cities begging, hoping for handouts and things like that, and had nowhere else to go. There was very strict laws and regulations on everything. And punishments often came in the form of capital punishment. You were physically punished. You could go to the stocks, you could be hung, beheaded, and things like that for different crimes. Trade was extremely regulated, as your book said. You had to join a guild, and the guild was stuck within a city, and they regulated everything from how the things you made looked, what materials you could use, who you bought your initial materials from, even who you could sell to and at what price. So everything was extremely regulated. The good part about this is that it helped make sure that products weren't exactly junk, because that would look bad on the guild. The bad part is it artificially inflated prices. It killed innovation, because nobody could join in the marketplace. and it paved the way to be very corrupt. So there's usually cities had a lot of laws regarding things like you couldn't bring in weapons or draft animals to drag wagons. There usually wasn't room anyways. Your book's correct to say that the people who were outsiders who could sell were basically, when it says wholesale, they're talking about people who can sell raw goods, right? Like sheep's wool, fruits and vegetables, things that haven't been turned into a product yet, maybe raw hides from cattle that haven't been even tanned or made into leather. However, selling finished goods was forbidden unless you're in a guild. They had guilds for all kinds of things. So you could have, yes, there'd be a general blacksmith's guild, but then there would be separate blacksmiths guilds as well, such as armor makers, swords maker, shoemakers, nail makers, all that stuff would have their own guilds. And of course, the more skill and the more value a guild had, the more rich its members. And a very wealthy guild could have an elaborate guild hall with their own church, and they would often, their members would be rather wealthy, and things like that. Whereas the poorer guilds, not so much. Such as like there's even a guild for selling used clothing. But that was a really big thing because clothing was very expensive for a lot of people. And so reselling clothes was kind of important. The shoemakers were definitely part of a guild. And here you see they're selling their wares outside of their shop, which is also their house. And of course, a lot of the menial labor would be done by the apprentice. A journeyman could often have his own place, but he couldn't have an apprentice until he is a master. And you see that this is kind of like, it's kind of like how you become a knight. You had to start with an apprentice, and then you moved up to an apprentice with more like an acolyte, and then you could be a knight, right? There's a Dyers Guild. Of course, there's like tailors, coopers who made like barrels, millers. So the guilds is the closest thing to a middle class the Middle Ages had. And guild members often, remember I told you the life of a medieval person revolved around religion. So if you remember from our reading on the church back then, there was a lot of religious holidays, right? So that was the big to-do. And so one thing that a lot of guilds would do is they would put on parades that were known as pageants. And a pageant is essentially a religious play. It's whenever you have a scene out of the Bible or out of a saint's life after the Bible, and they would reenact it. Some guilds would do it on these moving wagons that were richly decorated, and people would come watch, and it'd be a competition to see which guild did the best. The guild that did the best would get a trophy and all kinds of honors and things like that. Sometimes these pageants in some cities, if they couldn't do an outdoor one, they would have their cathedrals would have pageants. If you go to ancient cathedrals in Europe, you'll often see they have these little stalls inside of the cathedral, and that's where they used to hold the little plays. Because you got to remember, a lot of medieval people were illiterate, so they couldn't read the Bible. And it was too expensive for them to get anyways, because paper hasn't really been developed in the West yet. And also, a lot of religious services, a good portion of it was done in Latin. A lot of people didn't speak Latin. Now, the sermons would be in their common language, but that would have to be like the pastor telling them about it afterwards. But a pageant was a good way to help teach biblical lessons to people in history and stuff. Guilds often had their fancy feast, depending on how rich their guild was and where they were, too. Like guilds in places like in Italy were very, very wealthy. Some guild members were richer than kings. However, if you go to some places where the guilds weren't that powerful, such as in Germany and stuff like that, or in Spain, it might be a smaller ordeal. So, pretty big to do. You wanted to be in that club. All right. Remember, these people are looked down upon by nobility because they're not fighters. They have dirty money. They work with their hands. So they saw this as very demeaning. All right, cool kids. So let's go ahead and start talking about this stuff. City layout. How are their cities laid out? It sounds great, man.
The streets were really narrow.
Yeah.
There was no room for anything. They were always surrounding churches.
Yeah, narrow streets, churches. Cool. Yeah, hard to expand because those pesky walls.
Everything was really cramped together.
Yeah, that's true too. There's a lot of you go to Europe, there's a lot of cities that still have like in their town center the old medieval city, and it's like that now. Like a lot of German, Italian cities, stuff like that, or in England, you go in and yeah, the streets are narrow. It's hard for people to walk by two-way, you know, and it's just like zigzag, all that. So what else?
It was really dark.
Dark,
So
yeah.
It was hard to see at night.
Yeah, they didn't have any lamps. Walls were in the way. Anything else? Yeah. We could call it organic, right? People just built where they could. No city planning. Yeah. All right. I think we can leave it with that. Oops. All right. So, very good. Very good. Don't want to live there. Hey, sanitation. What do you think?
It pretty much didn't exist.
Yeah.
They threw out poop on the streets.
Yeah.
Sometimes
Filthy.
they would do it on backyards. You know, throw everything, all the trash on the streets.
Yeah. No care for sanitation. And it's going to take time. But later on, a lot of cities are going to make laws. We're like, hey, after you slaughter a pig, you can't just throw its guts on the ground. You got to take that stuff out of the city walls. Like you have to tell people not to do that. So yeah, so like excrement and trash in the streets.
They also, their water system was all polluted.
Yeah, dirty water.
Yeah.
And they're like wondering why they get sick and dying. They didn't understand germ theory. They honestly thought it was. I mean, there were a lot of people were really superstitious back then too. So a lot of them thought it had to do with spiritual matters. Explained all illness. I drank water that the cows have been going to the bathroom in. Now I'm sick. It must be a spiritual matter, you know. So, well, maybe some things are, but not that. Okay, so, yeah, and another thing is high death rate.
Mm-hmm.
Much higher death rate to live in the city. But yeah, they had a high birth rate too, so they offset. I mean, and also people were coming in from the countryside because if you're poor and starving, you have to go at least where there's some matter of success, you know? All right, cool. Thank you, Edwin. All right, now, the Merchant Guild. So what were the Merchant Guilds about?
It was just a bunch of traders and merchants that came together and started a monopoly over the town and city.
Yeah.
And they established where people had to pay taxes on stuff, like, you know, I don't know, just like town tools. And they had to sell wholesale, so they couldn't really sell anything other than just like natural, organic stuff.
Yeah. Taxes on outside. Yeah, regulated all trade. So it's like, you could be like, if in town, if like, I don't know, like Target and Walmart got together and be like, we are the Merchants Guild. We don't make anything, but we're going to tell you how to trade. And so then they start taxing Berkshires and Walgreens and all that stuff, and telling them what they can and cannot sell. So, very good. All right. So, the point is, too, here, that in medieval cities, what you see is that a lot of the function of government isn't done by the governmental bodies. It's actually done by private citizen groups are making the rules. Now, and they make a lot of rules. So now, the mayors, of course, would have rules, but that had to do more with like crimes as far as like theft, murder, things like that, like serious crimes. And of course, matters of city safety from intruders, bandits, and stuff. So, all right, craft guilds. So, what's the deal with craft guilds?
It was like a branch of the merchant guilds with like people who made things like shoes and baskets and armor and stuff.
Yeah.
And they all lived in like the same street, like just the same area.
Yeah.
And nobody who wasn't a part of the craft guild couldn't craft anything. They had to be a part of the craft guild in order to make stuff.
Yeah. Held a monopoly. On their product types. I'm going to get rid of this purple. Yeah, it could be hat makers, glove makers, people who blew glass into bottles, wine makers, just anything you could think of that's a finished product and that a medieval person could want, right? So, good. Last one, guys. Guild functions and benefits. So what did they do and how did it help one another and the people around them?
They have their own charitable and religious aspects.
Yeah. So charitable and religious.
And each guild had their own way of raising benefit funds.
Okay. Raised benefit funds like for widows and orphans.
Yes, and themselves.
Yeah. What about their benefits as far as the marketplace to consumers and stuff like that?
In the 19th century, they gave way to trade unions.
Yeah, phased out. In 19th century. So they can't keep up with modernity. They just can't do it. But what are their benefits to the society that they're in besides their charitable ones? As far as when I'm talking about the marketplace, I'm talking about buying and selling. How do they help out everyday people as far as their product?
The people who use that product.
Yeah. Was it junk?
No, it's actually handmade stuff.
Okay, yeah, so offered some quality control and protection for the consumer. That's the person buying stuff. So by that I'm saying like they just can't sell poison and call it medicine. Though that did happen by accident. Apothecaries often, this is pretty scientific method, but like the butchers weren't allowed to sell rotten meat because then they would get thrown out of the guild and they wouldn't be able to be a butcher anymore. So that's an example. Shoemakers weren't allowed to sell shoes that were so bad that they'd fall apart in a couple of days. Then they would get thrown out of the shoemaking guilds. They had to make sure their products were good. So this made sure that there was some consumer protections in a society that wasn't capitalistic yet, but also didn't offer government protection yet either. So they didn't have either one of those things. They didn't have the free market to regulate good products, and they didn't have a government to command good products. So it had to be the guilds, a collection of citizens that got together and made sure things actually worked. And so there we have it. Very good, kids. So that's going to end our lecture today. We'll have another one on Monday and an assignment tomorrow. See you later. Very good, folks.